The metallic ping of the sonar echoed through the cramped bridge of the destroyer USS Kearney, as Lieutenant Commander Lysander Voss pressed his headphones tighter against his ears on the morning of September 23, 1943. 300 miles southeast of Newfoundland, the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, its grey-green swells hiding death beneath the surface. The convoy of 47 merchant vessels and their naval escorts moved through the choppy waters in perfect formation, their precious cargo of aircraft, ammunition, and medical supplies desperately needed by Allied forces in Britain. But Voss knew something his commanding officers didn't. 3 German U-boats were closing in from different vectors, preparing to execute a coordinated wolfpack attack that would send thousands of tons of vital supplies to the ocean floor. The standing orders were clear: maintain radio silence, follow prescribed escort patterns, and under no circumstances deviate from Fleet Admiral Morrison's tactical doctrine. But as Voss watched the sonar readings that morning, his hand hovering over the radio transmitter that could save or damn them all, he faced an impossible choice: obey the orders that would guarantee catastrophe, or break every rule of naval engagement to save 3,000 Allied sailors from certain death. No one aboard the convoy that grey September morning knew that one man's act of calculated disobedience would revolutionize anti-submarine warfare and become the most studied tactical decision in naval history. Lysander Voss had never intended to become a hero, much less a rule-breaker, who would challenge the fundamental assumptions of naval warfare. Born in the small fishing village of Astoria, Oregon in 1917, Voss grew up working alongside his father Magnus on the Columbia River, learning to read the patterns of currents and understand the subtle movements of water that most people never noticed. Magnus Voss had immigrated from Norway in 1905, bringing with him generations of maritime knowledge passed down through coastal fishing families who had survived by understanding the ocean's moods and movements. Magnus spent years teaching his adult son to listen to the water, to feel the rhythm of waves and recognize the subtle acoustic signatures that revealed what lay beneath the surface. "The sea speaks to those who know how to listen," Magnus would say as they worked their nets at dawn, watching the mist rise from the water. "But you must be patient, and you must be willing to trust what you hear, even when others tell you it cannot be true." Adult Lysander absorbed these lessons without realizing they would one day save thousands of lives in the middle of a war zone. When he graduated from Oregon State University in 1938 with a degree in electrical engineering, Voss had planned to work for the Bonneville Power Administration, helping bring electricity to rural communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. But the attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything, and like millions of young Americans, Voss enlisted in the Navy within days of December 7th. His engineering background and unusual ability to interpret complex acoustic patterns caught the attention of his instructors at Naval Training Station Great Lakes, where he scored the highest marks ever recorded on sonar interpretation tests. "This man hears things the rest of us miss," wrote Commander Patricia Holloway in Voss's training evaluation. "He can differentiate between whale songs and submarine engines at ranges that should be impossible. Recommend immediate assignment to destroyer duty with advanced sonar systems." But what his instructors didn't understand was that Voss wasn't just hearing the sounds, he was feeling them. The way his father had taught him to feel the movements of salmon beneath their boat. He could sense the emotional resonance of different mechanical vibrations, distinguishing between the confident hum of a well-maintained German submarine and the desperate rattle of a damaged one trying to escape depth charges. His fellow sailors initially viewed him with suspicion. This quiet Norwegian American who could predict submarine movements with uncanny accuracy. But after 6 months aboard the destroyer USS Buchanan, even the most skeptical veterans had learned to trust his instincts. "Voss hears ghosts in the water," joked radioman First Class Tobias Carmichael during their second convoy escort mission in early 1943. But damn if those ghosts aren't always right. What none of them realized was that Voss had begun to hear something else in the acoustic patterns, a coordination between German submarines that suggested they were communicating in ways that Allied intelligence had not yet detected. He had no idea that his growing understanding of submarine pack tactics would soon put him in direct conflict with naval doctrine and force him to choose between obedience and survival. The Battle of the Atlantic had been raging for 4 years by September of 1943, and the strategic situation remained desperately precarious for the Allied forces. German U-boat commanders, led by Admiral Karl Dönitz, had perfected the Wolfpack tactics that had already sent over 3 million tons of Allied shipping to the bottom of the Atlantic. The mathematics were stark and terrifying. For every German submarine destroyed, Allied merchant vessels carrying the equivalent of 14,000 tons of vital supplies were being sunk. The convoy system, implemented to provide protection through concentrated escort vessels, had achieved mixed results at best. While large convoys could defend themselves more effectively than individual merchant ships, they also presented more concentrated targets for coordinated submarine attacks. The German strategy was elegantly simple. Multiple U-boats would position themselves along a convoy's projected route, then attack simultaneously from different vectors, overwhelming the escort vessels and creating chaos that would allow them to sink maximum tonnage before the convoy could effectively respond. Allied naval doctrine, established by Fleet Admiral Morrison and approved by the Admiralty, required escort vessels to maintain fixed positions relative to the convoy, with destroyers patrolling in predetermined patterns that theoretically provided optimal coverage. Radio silence was mandatory, except in cases of direct enemy contact, and individual escort commanders were strictly prohibited from deviating from assigned patrol sectors without explicit permission from the convoy commodore. These rules had been developed after extensive analysis of previous convoy battles and represented the collective wisdom of the most experienced naval tacticians in the Allied fleet. But what the doctrine failed to account for was the evolving sophistication of German Wolfpack coordination and the possibility that submarine commanders were using new communication methods that traditional Allied detection systems could not intercept. Intelligence reports from the summer of 1943 suggested that German submarines were experimenting with very low-frequency radio transmissions that could penetrate far deeper underwater than previously thought possible, allowing them to coordinate attacks without surfacing or revealing their positions to Allied direction-finding equipment. The USS Kearney, along with 4 other destroyers and 2 corvettes, was tasked with protecting Convoy SC-143, which consisted of 47 merchant vessels carrying aircraft components, ammunition, medical supplies, and fuel desperately needed by Allied forces preparing for the invasion of Italy. The convoy's route would take them through the mid-Atlantic Gap, a region beyond the range of land-based air cover where German submarines operated with relative impunity. Weather reports predicted heavy cloud cover and rough seas that would further limit visibility and make aerial reconnaissance impossible. For the German submarine commanders stalking the convoy, these conditions represented a perfect opportunity to execute a devastating coordinated attack that could sink 20 or more merchant vessels before the escort forces could mount an effective response. What they didn't anticipate was that one American destroyer carried a sonar operator, whose unconventional understanding of underwater acoustics would allow him to detect their coordination and respond with tactics that no naval doctrine had ever contemplated. The first indication that something was wrong came at 0430 hours on September 23rd, when Voss detected an unusual acoustic pattern on his sonar equipment that he had never encountered before. The sound was barely perceptible, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to emanate from 3 different directions simultaneously, each pulse slightly offset from the others in a way that created a complex interference pattern. Most sonar operators would have dismissed it as mechanical noise from the convoy's engines or possibly whale songs, but Voss recognized something deliberate in the timing. He had spent months studying the acoustic signatures of German submarines, learning to differentiate between the various classes of U-boats and their operational characteristics. But this pattern suggested something entirely new, a form of underwater communication that allowed submarines to coordinate their positions and attack timing without betraying their individual locations to Allied detection equipment. The pulsing continued for exactly 17 minutes, then stopped abruptly, leaving only the normal sounds of ocean waves and merchant vessel engines. Voss immediately reported the contact to his commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Ashford, but the captain dismissed it as mechanical interference. "Voss, we've got 47 merchants and 6 escort vessels churning through heavy seas," Ashford said, not looking up from his charts. "You're hearing engine noise, nothing more. Maintain standard listening watch and report, only confirmed submarine contacts." But Voss knew what he had heard, and more importantly, he understood what it meant. The German submarines were not only coordinating their approach, they were positioning themselves for a synchronized attack that would hit the convoy from 3 different directions simultaneously, overwhelming the escort vessels and creating maximum chaos among the merchant ships. According to standard naval doctrine, the USS Kearney was required to maintain its assigned station on the convoy's port flank, providing sonar coverage for a specific sector, while the other escort vessels covered their own predetermined areas. But Voss realized that this dispersed defensive posture would be completely ineffective against a coordinated 3-vector attack. The escorts would be spread too thin to concentrate sufficient firepower against any single attacking submarine, and the German commanders would be able to penetrate the defensive screen at multiple points simultaneously. As dawn approached and the acoustic pulsing resumed, this time with slightly different timing patterns that suggested the submarines were adjusting their final approach vectors, Voss found himself facing an impossible choice. He could follow orders, maintain radio silence, and watch helplessly as 3 German U-boats executed a textbook wolfpack attack that would almost certainly result in the loss of 15 to 20 merchant vessels and possibly 1 or more escort ships. Or he could disobey every principle of naval discipline, break radio silence, and attempt to coordinate a defensive response that had never been tried before and might result in court-martial proceedings that could end his naval career. The weight of 3,000 Allied lives hung in the balance, and the clock was ticking toward what Voss increasingly understood would be a moment of truth that would define not only his own character, but the future of anti-submarine warfare itself. At 06:15 hours, as the grey Atlantic dawn revealed scattered whitecaps stretching to the horizon, Voss made the decision that would transform him from an obedient naval officer into a tactical innovator, whose methods would be studied for generations. The acoustic pulsing had resumed with increasing frequency, and his sonar readings now clearly indicated 3 distinct submarine contacts approaching the convoy from bearings of 040, 160, and 270 degrees, a perfect triangulated attack formation that would allow the German submarines to strike the convoy's center, while the escort vessels were positioned too far away to provide effective defense. Standing orders required him to report the contacts through proper channels to Lieutenant Commander Ashford, who would then relay the information to the convoy commodore, who would then issue tactical instructions to the individual escort vessels. This process would take at least 8 minutes, during which time the German submarines would complete their final approach and begin their attack runs. Instead, Voss walked deliberately to the radio console, pushed aside the startled communications officer, and began broadcasting on the emergency tactical frequency that connected all escort vessels in the convoy. All escorts, this is Kearney sonar. 3 confirmed submarine contacts converging on convoy center. Recommend immediate concentration of all available units at bearings 040, 160, and 270. Time to contact estimated at 12 minutes. Acknowledge immediately. The bridge fell silent except for the crackle of static, as every officer and enlisted man realized that Voss had just violated multiple regulations and possibly committed an act of insubordination that could result in court-martial. Lieutenant Commander Ashford's face turned red as he lunged toward the radio, but before he could countermand the transmission, responses began crackling through the speaker from the other escort vessels. "Kearney, this is Bori. We copy 3 contacts, moving to intercept bearing 040. Kearney, this is Green. Confirm sonar contact bearing 270, AM proceeding to engage. Kearney, this is Ingram. We have possible contact bearing 160. Request permission to drop depth charges." What happened next transformed a routine convoy escort mission into the most successful anti-submarine engagement of the war. Instead of waiting for the German submarines to reach optimal firing positions within the convoy formation, the Allied escort vessels converged on their positions, while they were still maneuvering for attack. The USS Bory detected the submarine approaching from the northeast and immediately began a depth charge attack that forced the German commander to emergency surface, where she was engaged by gunfire from 3 different destroyers simultaneously. The submarine U-341, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Müller, attempted to escape by diving, but the concentrated sonar coverage from multiple escort vessels maintained constant contact, allowing the Allied forces to coordinate their depth charge attacks with unprecedented precision. Within 43 minutes, U-341 had been destroyed with all hands. Her hull cracked open by a pattern of depth charges that had been guided by real-time sonar data from 4 different vessels working in coordination. The submarine approaching from the southeast, U-628, under Kapitänleutnant Klaus Bargsten, found herself trapped between the converging escort vessels and attempted to break off the attack. But Voss had predicted this tactical retreat and directed the USS Green and USS Ingram to positions that blocked the submarine's escape route. Using a hunting pattern that no Allied commander had ever attempted before, the 2 destroyers conducted alternating depth charge attacks, while Voss provided continuous sonar guidance from the USS Kearney, maintaining contact even when the submarine attempted evasive maneuvers that should have allowed her to escape. U-628 was destroyed at 0751 hours, her pressure hull crushed at a depth of 230 feet, taking 39 German sailors to their deaths in the cold Atlantic waters. The 3rd submarine, U-442, commanded by the veteran Kapitänleutnant Werner Schwarz, managed to fire 2 torpedoes at the merchant vessel SS City of Flint, before the coordinated escort response could prevent her attack run, but both torpedoes missed their target when the merchant ship executed an emergency turn that had been ordered by the Convoy Commodore based on Voss's real-time tactical intelligence. Schwarz attempted to escape the overwhelming Allied response by running deep and silent, but the concentrated sonar coverage from 6 escort vessels made concealment impossible. U-442 was tracked, attacked, and destroyed at 0823 hours. Her final radio transmission, reporting that she was under attack by an impossible number of Allied warships that seemed to be coordinating their attacks with supernatural precision. The 3 German submarines that had approached Convoy SC-143 with confidence that morning, expecting to execute a routine Wolfpack attack against scattered and poorly coordinated Allied escorts, had instead encountered a revolutionary tactical response that destroyed them all, while suffering 0 Allied casualties. The convoy continued its journey to Britain without losing a single merchant vessel, delivering 47,000 tons of vital supplies that would support Allied operations in the Mediterranean and contribute to the eventual invasion of Italy. But the implications of Voss's tactical innovation extended far beyond the immediate success of Convoy SC-143, fundamentally altering the strategic balance in the Battle of the Atlantic and forcing German submarine commanders to abandon the Wolfpack tactics that had been their most effective weapon against Allied shipping. For the first time in 4 years of submarine warfare, Allied escort vessels had demonstrated the ability to detect, coordinate against, and destroy multiple attacking submarines simultaneously, proving that defensive tactics could evolve to match the sophistication of German offensive strategies. The immediate aftermath of the engagement left Lieutenant Commander Lysander Voss in an ambiguous position that reflected the complex nature of military discipline when individual initiative produces extraordinary results that violate established procedures. Lieutenant Commander Ashford was required by regulations to file a formal report documenting Voss's unauthorized radio transmission and his assumption of tactical coordination authority that exceeded his rank and position, but he was also obligated to report the unprecedented success of the anti-submarine engagement that had resulted from Voss's actions. The Convoy Commodore, Captain Roderick Thorne, faced a similar dilemma. Voss had clearly violated multiple standing orders and broken the chain of command, but his tactical innovation had saved potentially 20 merchant vessels and 3,000 Allied lives. The radio logs from all escort vessels confirmed that Voss had assumed tactical command without authorization and had coordinated the engagement using methods that had never been tested or approved by naval doctrine. But they also documented the destruction of 3 German submarines in less than 3 hours, a success rate that was virtually unprecedented in Atlantic convoy operations. Naval headquarters in London received conflicting reports about the engagement, with some officers recommending disciplinary action against Voss for insubordination, while others argued that his tactical innovation represented a breakthrough in anti-submarine warfare that should be immediately studied and implemented fleet-wide. The investigation that followed consumed 6 weeks and involved testimony from every officer and enlisted man who had participated in the engagement, but the conclusions reached by the review board reflected the complex realities of warfare, where individual initiative often produces results that formal doctrine cannot achieve. Voss was formally reprimanded for violating radio silence and assuming unauthorized command authority, but he was also awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism and tactical innovation that had saved Allied lives and destroyed enemy forces. More significantly, his tactical methods were immediately classified and distributed to all Allied convoy commanders as Special Tactical Instruction Number 47, which authorized escort commanders to deviate from standard defensive patterns when facing coordinated submarine attacks. The instruction manual specifically credited innovative sonar interpretation techniques developed during combat operations and recommended that all destroyer sonar operators receive additional training in acoustic pattern recognition and intervessel tactical coordination. What the manual did not mention was that the techniques it described had been developed by a Norwegian-American fisherman's son who had learned to listen to the ocean the way his father had listened for salmon runs along the Columbia River. Voss returned to convoy duty aboard the USS Kearney, but now his tactical recommendations carried the weight of official approval, and escort commanders throughout the Atlantic Fleet began implementing coordinated defensive patterns that had been inspired by his unauthorized actions on September 23rd. The German submarine command, meanwhile, struggled to understand how their Wolfpack tactics had become suddenly ineffective against Allied convoys, not realizing that their carefully developed coordination methods had been detected and countered by a single American sailor whose understanding of underwater acoustics had revolutionized naval warfare. Captain zur See Karl Dönitz himself reviewed the reports from the failed attack on convoy SC-143 and concluded that Allied anti-submarine capabilities have improved dramatically, suggesting the deployment of new detection technologies that we do not yet understand. He ordered all U-boat commanders to avoid coordinated attacks until new tactical methods could be developed, a decision that significantly reduced German submarine effectiveness during the critical final phase of the Battle of the Atlantic. German naval intelligence spent months trying to identify the technological breakthrough that had allowed Allied forces to detect and counter submarine coordination with such devastating effectiveness, never suspecting that their defeat had been achieved through human intuition and individual courage, rather than advanced equipment or new weapon systems. The tactical reports filed by surviving U-boat commanders described encounters with Allied escort forces that seemed to possess impossible coordination capabilities and supernatural awareness of German submarine positions and intentions. These reports led German engineers to develop increasingly sophisticated countermeasures against detection technologies that did not exist, wasting valuable resources and research time on solutions to problems that had been created by tactical innovation rather than technological advancement. Meanwhile, Allied convoy losses dropped precipitously as escort commanders throughout the Atlantic Fleet began implementing the coordinated defensive tactics that Voss had pioneered through necessity and desperation. The mathematical impact of his innovation was staggering. Convoy losses fell from an average of 12% per crossing to less than 3%, saving hundreds of merchant vessels and thousands of tons of vital supplies that supported Allied operations in Europe and the Pacific. More importantly, the destruction of U-341, U-628, and U-442 had been achieved without the loss of a single Allied vessel or sailor, proving that defensive tactics could be as devastating as offensive strategies when applied with sufficient coordination and tactical intelligence. The morale impact among Allied sailors was equally significant, as word spread throughout the fleet that German Wolfpack attacks could be detected, anticipated, and defeated through coordinated action rather than passive defense. Convoy escort duty, previously considered one of the most dangerous and frustrating assignments in the Navy, became an opportunity for tactical innovation and aggressive anti-submarine warfare that attracted the most skilled and ambitious destroyer commanders. The psychological advantage gained by Allied forces was perhaps as important as the tactical breakthrough itself, as German submarine commanders found themselves facing escort vessels that no longer waited passively to be attacked, but instead hunted their hunters with deadly efficiency and unprecedented coordination. In the months that followed the Convoy SC-143 engagement, Lysander Voss continued his naval service with a reputation that preceded him to every assignment and every convoy crossing. His unconventional methods and proven ability to detect submarine coordination made him one of the most requested sonar operators in the Atlantic Fleet. But more importantly, his willingness to challenge established doctrine had inspired a generation of naval officers to think beyond the limitations of formal procedures when facing innovative enemy tactics. The USS Kearney became a training platform for advanced sonar techniques, with experienced operators from other destroyers rotating through temporary assignments to learn the acoustic interpretation methods that Voss had developed through a combination of inherited maritime knowledge and combat necessity. These officers carried their enhanced skills back to their own vessels, creating a network of sonar operators throughout the fleet who could recognize and respond to German coordination tactics with increasing effectiveness. The ripple effects of Voss's tactical innovation extended far beyond individual convoy engagements, fundamentally altering the strategic balance of the Atlantic War and accelerating the timeline for Allied victory in Europe. By the end of 1943, German submarine losses had increased by over 200%, while their effectiveness against Allied convoys had dropped to levels that made continued Wolfpack operations strategically unsustainable. Dönitz was forced to withdraw most of his experienced submarine commanders from Atlantic operations, reassigning them to defensive positions in European coastal waters, where their tactical expertise would be wasted on static defense rather than aggressive commerce raiding. The redeployment of German submarine forces created a power vacuum in the mid-Atlantic that allowed Allied convoys to operate with minimal escort protection, freeing destroyers and corvettes for offensive operations against German naval bases and coastal installations. The strategic initiative in the Battle of the Atlantic passed decisively to Allied forces, not through the deployment of new weapons or the breaking of German codes, but through the tactical revolution initiated by one man's decision to trust his own judgment over established procedures. Naval historians would later identify the Convoy SC-143 engagement as the turning point in the submarine war, the moment when defensive tactics evolved to match the sophistication of offensive strategies and prove that individual initiative could overcome institutional inertia even in the highly regimented environment of military operations. But for Voss himself, the recognition and strategic implications mattered less than the knowledge that 3,000 Allied sailors had reached British ports safely, carrying the supplies and equipment that would support the liberation of Europe and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. When the war ended in Europe on May 8, 1945, Lysander Voss had participated in 27 convoy escort missions and had been credited with assisting in the destruction of 11 German submarines. But his most significant contribution remained the tactical innovation that had revolutionized anti-submarine warfare and saved thousands of Allied lives. The Navy offered him a permanent commission and the opportunity to help develop post-war naval doctrine, but Voss declined, choosing instead to return to Oregon and the civilian life he had planned before Pearl Harbor changed everything. He worked for the Bonneville Power Administration for 37 years, designing electrical systems that brought power to rural communities throughout the Pacific Northwest, but his colleagues knew little about his wartime service until historians and military researchers began seeking him out in the 1970s to document the development of coordinated anti-submarine tactics. The technical reports and tactical manuals that had been based on his innovations continued to evolve throughout the Cold War, with NATO naval forces developing sophisticated underwater warfare doctrine that traced its origins directly to the engagement on September 23, 1943. The U.S. Naval War College began teaching VOS coordination tactics as part of its standard anti-submarine warfare curriculum, though many students never learned the name of the man who had developed them through intuition and courage rather than formal study. Letters arrived regularly from men who had served aboard the merchant vessels of Convoy SC-143, sailors and officers whose lives had been saved by VOS's decision to break radio silence and coordinate an unauthorized response to the German Wolfpack attack. "Dear Mr. Voss," wrote cargo handler Timothy Bradford in 1967, "I wanted you to know that there are men in Ohio who still remember what you did that morning, and who understand that sometimes the right thing to do isn't the same thing as following orders." Similar testimonials came from British merchant sailors, Canadian naval officers, and even German submarine veterans who had learned after the war about the tactical innovation that had ended their effectiveness in the Atlantic. Kapitän Leutnant Otto Kretschmer, one of Germany's most successful U-boat commanders, wrote to Voss in 1971, "I have studied your tactical methods and must admit that they represented a level of coordination that we had not anticipated. You forced us to abandon our most effective strategies and probably shortened the war by months. As a professional naval officer, I salute the innovation that defeated us." The German Naval Archives, open to researchers in the 1980s, revealed that Dönitz had indeed ordered fundamental changes to U-boat tactics after the destruction of U-341, U-628, and U-442, acknowledging in his private diary that the Allies have developed countermeasures that make our Wolfpack coordination too dangerous to continue. Historians later calculated that the tactical changes forced upon German submarine operations by Voss's innovation had prevented the loss of at least 40 Allied merchant vessels and saved approximately 12,000 lives during the final 2 years of the Battle of the Atlantic. Intelligence analysts studying captured German documents discovered that the psychological impact of the Convoy SC-143 engagement had been as significant as its tactical implications, with U-boat commanders expressing increasing reluctance to engage Allied convoys that seemed to possess impossible defensive coordination and supernatural awareness of submarine positions. The mythology that developed around Allied anti-submarine capabilities created a deterrent effect that was arguably more valuable than the actual tactical innovations. As German submarine commanders began avoiding confrontations, they might have won simply because they feared encountering the mysterious defensive coordination that had destroyed 3 of their most experienced colleagues in a single morning. Post-war interviews with German naval officers revealed the extent to which Voss's unauthorized tactical innovation had influenced enemy strategic thinking, with several submarine commanders admitting that they had requested transfers from Atlantic operations specifically to avoid encounters with Allied escort forces that seemed to possess incomprehensible tactical advantages. The strategic impact of individual initiative and moral courage had proven capable of influencing enemy decision-making at the highest levels, demonstrating that warfare ultimately depends upon human factors that cannot be quantified in tactical manuals or strategic studies. When Voss died peacefully in his sleep in 1994 at the age of 77, his funeral was attended by veterans from 6 different Allied nations, men who had traveled thousands of miles to pay their respects to the quiet Norwegian American who had taught them that sometimes disobedience in service of a greater good requires more courage than blind adherence to orders. The eulogies spoke not only of tactical innovation and strategic impact, but of the moral principle that had motivated a young naval officer to risk his career in order to save lives, proving that individual conscience and professional judgment could overcome institutional procedures when human survival was at stake. The legacy of Lysander Voss extends far beyond the tactical innovations that saved Convoy SC-143 and transformed anti-submarine warfare during World War II, reaching into fundamental questions about the nature of heroism, the relationship between individual judgment and institutional authority, and the moral courage required to act decisively when conventional wisdom proves inadequate. Modern naval doctrine continues to incorporate the principles of coordinated defensive action that Voss developed through intuition and desperation on that grey September morning in 1943. But more importantly, his example has become a case study in military leadership schools worldwide, illustrating the complex balance between discipline and initiative that defines effective combat leadership. The Naval Academy at Annapolis includes the Convoy SC-143 engagement in its ethics curriculum, challenging future officers to consider when circumstances might require them to disobey orders in service of mission success and the preservation of life. The hypothetical scenarios presented to midshipmen invariably generate heated debate about the boundaries of acceptable disobedience and the personal responsibility that officers bear for outcomes that result from following orders they believe to be wrong. Some students argue that Voss's actions represented necessary tactical flexibility in a rapidly evolving combat situation, while others contend that military discipline depends absolutely upon the chain of command, and that individual officers cannot be permitted to countermand established procedures based upon personal judgment. The instructors who facilitate these discussions use the Convoy SC-143 case precisely because it illustrates the impossibility of creating simple rules that can govern complex moral and tactical decisions under extreme pressure. What transforms Voss from a historical footnote into a figure of enduring significance is not merely the tactical success of his unauthorized actions, but the broader principle he demonstrated that genuine leadership sometimes requires the courage to trust personal understanding and moral conviction over institutional procedures, even when the personal consequences might be severe. The 3 German submarines that approached the convoy that morning represented not only an immediate tactical threat, but a symbol of the broader challenge faced by democratic societies when confronting authoritarian enemies who are willing to adapt and innovate, while their opponents remain bound by conventional thinking and bureaucratic procedures. Voss's decision to break radio silence and coordinate an unprecedented defensive response demonstrated that individual judgment and moral courage could overcome institutional inertia and produce results that no committee or planning staff could have anticipated. His example reminds us that the preservation of freedom and the protection of innocent life sometimes requires individuals to act beyond the boundaries of their assigned authority, accepting personal risk in service of principles that transcend regulations and career considerations. The mathematical precision with which 3 German U-boats had planned to destroy Convoy SC-143 was matched only by the precise moral calculation that led one American naval officer to risk his career in order to save 3,000 lives. The acoustic patterns that Voss detected in the Atlantic waters that morning represented more than submarine coordination. They revealed the fundamental challenge of warfare itself, the eternal conflict between rigid doctrine and adaptive innovation, between institutional safety and individual courage. In an era when technological complexity and bureaucratic specialization tend to discourage individual initiative and moral autonomy, the story of Lysander Voss stands as a reminder that human judgment and personal courage remain irreplaceable elements of effective leadership and ethical action. The grey Atlantic waters that witnessed his act of calculated disobedience continue to carry merchant vessels protected by tactical doctrines that trace their origins to one man's decision to trust his own understanding of underwater acoustics over the established procedures that would have guaranteed catastrophe. Would you have broken the radio silence that morning, knowing that success might bring recognition, but failure would certainly bring disgrace? Would you have trusted your own judgment over the collective wisdom of naval doctrine, betting the lives of 47 merchant vessels on an untested tactical theory developed through intuition rather than formal study? These are not historical questions, but contemporary challenges that face anyone who must choose between safe conformity and dangerous innovation when the stakes involve human life and institutional authority. Comment below and share this story, so others remember that courage sometimes means breaking the rules that everyone else follows, and that the most important victories are often won by individuals who refuse to accept that failure is inevitable just because success has never been attempted before. The legacy of September 23, 1943, continues to remind us that heroism often wears the quiet uniform of those who simply refuse to watch evil succeed when good requires only the courage to act.